Good morning, guys. I just want to continue chapter 28 with you all today and go ahead and wrap that up. And we're looking at the progressive movement. And for third period, this will be new. For first period, I just want to sort of revisit the environmental stuff this last couple slides. So remember that Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive president, the first progressive president, is also going to be the first president to address, environmental issues in the United States. And really up until this point, Americans had not been, overly concerned with the environment. The West was basically seen just as a limitless area in terms of resources, and of course, we have seen the effects of that attitude with the near extinction of the bison. And so there are a few earlier attempts before Roosevelt to actually, do something about Western lands. In 1877, they passed a law called the Desert Land Act, which it was sort of like a homestead act for more arid places. And the idea was that you could give Americans land in the West that was more arid, and that in turn, hopefully, those lands could be effectively irrigated and made useful. Limited success on that. In 1891, we see by presidential order a new law called the Forest Reserve Act, which had set aside 46 million acres of land. And then in 1902, we get another sort of irrigation-based law in the Newlands Act, which basically sold land in the West for cheap prices under federal subsidy. And the idea there again was that those lands might be irrigated and made more efficient and actually useful. But again, I think limited success with this one as well, and definitely controversial. You don't need to know a lot of details about this. Just kind of keep in mind that there had been some attempts. Prior to the progressive movement to do things, and then the Newlands Act is another shot at irrigation. But and also, I should mention that national parks had already been established, including Yellowstone in, I believe, 1877. But that being said, the progressives under TR are the first ones to really look at land management and conservation in a systematic way. And the idea behind conservation, it's not so much that they wanted to preserve the land as it was and not touch it. But the idea that Roosevelt had with conservation was that the land should be used, and they should be taken advantage of by Americans as a resource. But at the same time, that should be done in a responsible way, in a way that was sustainable, in a way that wasn't reckless. So that's the difference there. So conservation is the thought that you use the land, you just use it responsibly, and that was what Roosevelt was big into pushing as part of his agenda as a progressive president. So under his presidency, and probably for Roosevelt, conservation may be the biggest legacy that he leaves behind. We see 230 million acres of federal lands protected under Roosevelt. Also, the establishment of the U.S. Forest Service, headed by a guy named Gifford Pinchot, to manage the forest. There is pretty much there's sort of two sides of thought to the movement, and the conservationist side is the one that Roosevelt most identifies with. There's another group, led by guys like John Muir, who's going to go on to start the Sierra Club. That pushes for preservation, and that means to leave lands as they are, kind of like more like what we see as environmentalism today. So there is a split between the preservationist and the conservationist, and it's sort of epitomized in a controversy in a place called the Hetch Hetchy Valley. The conservationists want to use it for irrigation to dam it up. The preservationists want to leave it as it is. Ultimately, we will see big business in the United States, even though at first they resist, conservation. That they ultimately are going to learn to work with the conservationists. So that's a big change as well. And here's just a couple images to see here. On the left, we got a cartoon of Roosevelt, and on the right, we see Roosevelt with John Muir, who went on to found the Sierra Club. So Roosevelt, as president, he was very popular. He's very successful. He wins easily in 1904. So this was the first time he had run for president, if you recall, because he initially gained the office through the assassination of McKinley. So he wins handily in 04. A lot of these policies that he has starting to make businesses nervous. If you remember, he intervenes in the coal strike on the side of the workers for the first time. He breaks up the Northern Securities Railroad, which is a blow to the trusts, and so a lot of his progressive policies make the more conservative Republicans, who represent the big business interest, nervous. Now he sort of makes a mistake politically when he announces that he won't run for re-election in 1908. He believed that, even though he hadn't served a full first term, he was more or less close enough, and he didn't believe that, at this time anyway, that a third term was proper. So he announces early on that he's not going to run again in 1908, and that takes away a little bit of his sway, I would say. He loses some of his power, so to speak, because people know he's not going to be there in 40 years, and so there's some thought about sort of waiting him out, from among his enemies. There is a small, I'd say, I mean, it's a financial panic. I'd say small in comparison to some of the other things that we've seen earlier, like 1893. But there's a run on the banks. Part of that is blamed on Roosevelt's policies, which many people see as anti-business. And this financial panic is kind of pinned on Roosevelt. This will lead the way later to some financial reform under Wilson, when he is going to look once again at the issue of currency and finally take that and put it in the hands of only the federal government. So we'll get into more of that later. But so just understand this panic sort of weakens Roosevelt in his second term. So ultimately, when his second term is up, we're going to see Roosevelt walk away from the presidency. He sort of handpicks his successor in the form of William Howard Taft. You guys remember Taft was the military governor of the Philippines. Under Roosevelt, he's Secretary of War, mildly sort of progressive. Roosevelt picks him. In this famous cartoon, we can see Roosevelt with the big stick being carried by his porter here. He's heading off, and he is handing over his policies right here to William Howard Taft, and they sort of paint Taft as like a nursemaid to Roosevelt's policies here. So Roosevelt, I think, believes that Taft is going to carry on with what he has been doing, and to some degree he does. Taft runs in 1908 against our old friend William Jennings Bryan. He's going to run and lose yet again, and Taft goes on to become the 27th president. So, and I'd say partly that's from riding in on Roosevelt's coattails. But if you start to look at TR's legacy, I mean, I think it is a big legacy. He's considered one of the best presidents in history. But certainly he begins to tame the big businesses of America, to start some regulation that we're going to see continued. Again, conservation is a massive legacy, and as, in terms of politics, he really enlarges the power of the presidency and the office of the presidency, sort of more like a modern presidency. Um, Uses that as his bully pulpit, as we talked about, to shape policy, to get his message out, to be at the head of the government and the fore of the government, and be the government official that most people recognize. Right? He shapes the progressive agenda that is to come. And in terms of foreign policy, he really puts the United States at the forefront of the world stage, shows that he's willing to intervene through that big stick policy in the Roosevelt corollary, modernizes the Navy, and really puts us in terms of foreign policy, at the forefront or on the point of that. So this is obviously a major legacy as well. Now, as president, we see Taft. He is going to be, he's definitely progressive, not quite as progressive as Roosevelt. He, it's weird with him. He's never really comfortable in his own skin. He once said that whenever, and he told this to Roosevelt later. He said, whenever someone comes in and says, "Mr. President," I look over my shoulder to see if you're in the room. He always kind of saw himself as a second fiddle, I think, to Roosevelt, and obviously, Roosevelt had sort of cast a long shadow. I mean, that was a hard guy to follow into office. Taft was way more passive. He avoided controversy. He didn't want to mix it up with Congress the way that Roosevelt would. His foreign policy is going to be based on what's called dollar diplomacy. And the idea of that is to encourage American investment in places where we had an interest, and use that investment to sort of manipulate. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. It's an alternative to military intervention. But to use our investments to sort of sway other governments and other areas to kind of do what we want them to do. Also to keep out other powers. If our dollars are there, then their investments don't have a place to sort of fall. He tries this in China with railroads. It kind of fails there. Russia and Japan resist. They already have sort of invested there. He also continues to invest in Latin America. But, as a result of that, that's also going to mean continued U.S. military intervention in Latin America, because when we invest there and our economic interests become threatened by, instability or unrest or even failure to pay those loans back, then the military has to be sent in. And we see that in places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic,